September 15th, 1987. Emily Townsend, 29, leaves her motel room in Pinecrest, Washington at 5:47 a.m., her backpack containing standard day hiking essentials. 7 years later, her preserved remains would be discovered, chained to an ancient stone altar, deep within an unmapped cave system that shouldn't have existed according to geological surveys. The morning Emily disappeared began with perfect hiking conditions: crisp autumn air, clear skies, and the kind of stillness that makes mountain landscapes feel sacred. Motel security footage showed her loading gear into her vehicle, checking her watch, and briefly speaking with the night clerk, who later reported she seemed relaxed, prepared, and excited about photographing some historic markers she'd read about. The time-stamped receipt from the Pinecrest diner indicated she purchased coffee and a breakfast sandwich at 6:12 a.m., then headed toward the eastern range of the Cascade Mountains, an area known for its remote beauty and challenging terrain. Her red Jeep Cherokee remained parked at Blackwater Trailhead for 3 days before park rangers, responding to reports of an abandoned vehicle, found her detailed hiking itinerary meticulously marked on a topographical map left on the passenger seat. The map contained additional notations in Emily's handwriting, including several question marks near unnamed ridge formations and a circled area approximately 4 miles from the main trail with the annotation, "Possible settlement ruins." Her camera was notably absent from the vehicle. Search and rescue operations mobilized within hours, combing 47 square miles of rugged terrain with teams of volunteers, trained dogs, and eventually helicopter sweeps that revealed nothing but wilderness undisturbed by human passage. Weather conditions remained favorable throughout the initial search period, eliminating the possibility that environmental factors had obscured evidence of Emily's movements. It was as if she walked into the forest and simply ceased to exist, recalled James Harmon, who led the primary search team. No disturbed vegetation, no discarded items, no tracks beyond the first half mile of established trail. Emily's younger sister Diane flew in from Chicago, identifying the belongings left in the Jeep: an extra jacket, a half-empty water bottle, a dog-eared copy of Indigenous Landmarks of the Pacific Northwest, all suggesting a planned day hike rather than an extended journey. Several pages in the book had been marked with small adhesive tabs, each corresponding to locations within 50 miles of Blackwater Trail. She was experienced, cautious to a fault, Diane told reporters at a press conference on day 5 of the search, her voice steady despite the dark circles under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights. Emily wouldn't venture off trail without telling someone. She wouldn't take unnecessary risks. Local newspaper archives revealed Emily had visited the Pinecrest Historical Society 3 times in the week before her hike, requesting access to regional maps and documentation of 19th century settlements. The Society's curator, Harold Kavanagh, remembered her as intensely curious about areas that rarely attract attention, not the established ghost towns that draw tourists, but places barely mentioned in county records. This information expanded the search radius, but yielded no additional clues. By week 3, when autumn's first snowfall dusted the higher elevations, the search scaled back to intermittent patrols and follow-ups on increasingly rare tips from the public. Emily's case file grew thick with interview transcripts, terrain analysis reports, and wildlife encounter statistics, but contained nothing that explained her complete absence from a landscape thoroughly examined by experts trained to find people who don't want to be found. Detective Marcus Reynolds, then a newly promoted investigator with the county sheriff's department, kept Emily's file open long after his superiors suggested classifying it as a probable wildlife attack, telling his partner, "People don't just evaporate into thin air. Something about this feels deliberate." Reynolds spent weekends retracing the initial search patterns, developing a theory that Emily had found something significant enough to draw her far beyond her planned route. 6 months after the disappearance, Reynolds interviewed a seasonal Forest Service employee who remembered seeing strange carvings on trees near the outer boundary of the search area, symbols that didn't look like standard trail markers or typical vandalism. When Reynolds attempted to locate these markings, he found the area had been burned in a controlled forestry operation, eliminating any potential evidence. The timing of the burn, scheduled months in advance, but occurring just weeks after Emily vanished, would later raise questions about possible interference in the investigation. Emily's sister maintained a small but dedicated awareness campaign, distributing flyers featuring Emily's photograph and establishing a modest reward fund for information. The flyers showed a woman with intelligent eyes behind wire-framed glasses, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a slight smile that suggested she was more comfortable behind a camera than in front of one. "She documented things others overlooked," Diane explained during the 1-year anniversary of the disappearance. Emily believed landscapes held stories most people never noticed. As subsequent missing persons cases demanded departmental resources, Emily's file gradually migrated to the growing collection of unsolved disappearances in Washington's wilderness areas. Statistical analyses linked most of these cases to misadventure, disorientation, or wildlife encounters. Emily's case, however, contained elements that resisted such classification: the absence of physical evidence, the precise planning of her hike, and the documented research interests that had brought her specifically to this remote location. In 1989, 2 hikers reported finding a woman's boot print in a stream bed approximately 6 miles from where Emily's Jeep had been parked, far outside the original search radius. Though plaster casts were made, comparative analysis proved inconclusive, and the potential lead dissolved into the growing mythology surrounding Emily's disappearance. Local rumors suggested everything from voluntary disappearance to alien abduction, narratives that further obscured the methodical work of investigators still quietly pursuing the case. Detective Reynolds, studying Emily's research interests during off-duty hours, began connecting her disappearance to historical patterns in the region. Other unexplained vanishings dating back generations, all occurring within a 50-mile radius, all involving solitary individuals with documented interest in the area's history or geography. These connections, dismissed by colleagues as coincidental, would prove critically important when Emily's remains were finally discovered in the spring of 1994. The mountains kept their secret, and Emily Townsend became a name on a missing persons database, until 7 years of silence were broken by an unexpected discovery that would transform a presumed wilderness tragedy into something far more disturbing, deliberate, and ancient. April 12, 1994. The case file on Emily Townsend had gathered dust for 7 years, relegated to a storage box marked "Cold Cases, Wilderness Disappearances." No one expected answers anymore, except for 2 people who never stopped looking. For 7 years, Emily Townsend existed only in missing persons databases, annual memorial hikes organized by her sister, and the nagging instinct that kept Detective Reynolds revisiting the case during late nights at his desk. The detective maintained a small bulletin board in his home office with photocopied maps, weather reports from September 15, 1987, and a photograph of Emily taken 3 days before her disappearance. Diane Townsend called him every 6 months, her hope diminishing with each conversation, but never completely extinguished. "Time doesn't make missing people less missing," Reynolds told a rookie detective who questioned his continued interest in the case. "It just makes finding them less probable." He had revisited the Blackwater trailhead 17 times over 7 years, walking different routes, speaking with seasonal rangers, searching for patterns others might have overlooked. His case notes had expanded to fill 3 additional notebooks, documenting similar disappearances dating back to 1953. Solitary hikers with intellectual interests who vanished without explanation. On April 10, 1994, unusually heavy spring rains triggered a series of minor landslides throughout the eastern Cascades. One such event, approximately 7 miles northeast of Blackwater Trailhead, exposed a narrow fissure in what locals had always considered a solid rock face. This discovery might have gone unnoticed if not for the research project of 2 graduate students from Washington State University. Graduate students Mira Chen and Jacob Donahue had no knowledge of Emily when they ventured into the unmapped cave system revealed by the landslide. Their geological survey, focused on regional fault line mapping, had brought them to this remote location with specialized equipment and university permits. The opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, showed no signs of previous human entry. No footprints, no debris, no markings of any kind. The initial passage descended at approximately 45 degrees for about 30 feet before leveling into what appeared to be a natural limestone chamber, Donahue later testified. "We documented standard cave formations for nearly 20 minutes before Mira noticed the artificial tunnel branching westward. This tunnel, unlike the natural formation surrounding it, showed evidence of deliberate construction, tool marks on the walls, a level floor, and a height consistent throughout its 70-foot length. Their headlamps illuminated what Mira would later describe in her police statement as a chamber that didn't belong there, too precise, too intentional, with an altar that made my skin crawl before I understood what I was seeing. The chamber, approximately 15 feet in diameter with a ceiling height of 7 feet, contained a single stone structure in its center, a rectangular altar approximately 4 feet high, 6 feet long, and 3 feet wide, carved from a type of stone inconsistent with the surrounding geology. On this altar lay human remains. My first thought was that we'd stumbled onto an archaeological site," Chen stated. "Then I saw the modern hiking boots. The remains were partially mummified, preserved by the cave's constant temperature and low humidity. Most disturbing were the restraints, iron chains securing the wrists to metal rings embedded in the stone, positioned as though the person had been deliberately displayed. The students retreated immediately, marking their path with reflective tape before hiking 3 hours to reach cellular service. Their call reached the county sheriff's office at 4:17 p.m. The county coroner confirmed the remains were Emily's through dental records, while preliminary analysis indicated the body had been preserved through environmental conditions within the cave and what appeared to be intentional chemical treatment of unknown origin. The preservation was so extensive that Emily's facial features remained recognizable, a fact that investigators carefully withheld from family members and the public. The body positioning suggests ritualistic placement rather than disposal, noted Dr. Elaine Suarez, the forensic anthropologist called to the scene. The arms were arranged in a specific position, and trace evidence indicates the presence of unidentified organic materials consistent with ceremonial practices. The chains binding the wrists, described in the forensic report as hand-forged iron, with symbols consistent with pre-Christian European iconography mixed with elements unidentified in current archaeological databases, contained microscopic blood residue not only from Emily, but from at least 6 other individuals. These genetic profiles, when run through national databases, matched no known missing persons cases, suggesting either unidentified victims or historical usage predating modern record-keeping. Media descended on the small mountain community like vultures, producing sensationalized headlines that reduced Emily to the altar victim, while locals locked their doors at night for the first time in decades. National news vans lined the main street of Pinecrest, reporters ambushing residents with questions about cult activity and ritual sacrifice. The county sheriff's office established a media containment protocol, limiting access to investigation sites and releasing only verified information through official channels. Dr. Catherine Morrison, called in from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, examined photographs of the scene without disturbing the forensic work still underway. "What we're seeing is not improvised," she concluded in her preliminary assessment. "The positioning, the preservation methods, the selection of location, all indicate planning, purpose, and adherence to specific protocols. This suggests either an individual with extensive knowledge of obscure ritualistic practices, or, more concerning, a group maintaining such traditions in secret." Inside the chamber, investigators documented 13 distinct symbols carved into the walls, patterns that matched no known religious or cultural iconography in federal databases. More disturbing was the discovery of a hidden compartment within the altar itself, containing what appeared to be ceremonial tools and a leather-bound journal written in a cipher that would take months to partially decode. Detective Reynolds, now heading the county's Major Crimes Division, stood in the cave chamber where technicians photographed every inch of the scene and thought, this wasn't opportunistic. This was ceremonial, practiced, patient. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cave's cool air. "How many times has this happened?" he asked Dr. Morrison. "How many missing hikers were classified as lost to the wilderness when they were actually taken?" As Emily's sister flew in to make formal identification through photographs, Reynolds committed himself to answering a question 7 years in the making. Who would create such an elaborate ritual space miles from civilization? And what connection did they have to a woman whose only apparent crime was hiking alone in a landscape she loved? The mountains had finally yielded their secret, but the revelation opened doors to darker questions that would transform a single missing persons case into an investigation spanning decades, multiple victims, and a conspiracy of silence maintained by a community with something terrible to hide. April 18th, 1994. The Pinecrest Community Center transformed overnight from a venue for town meetings and bingo nights into the nerve center of what local officials now classified as a major criminal investigation. The fluorescent lights remained on at all hours, casting harsh shadows across walls now covered with evidence of something far older and darker than anyone had initially suspected. Detective Reynolds established an incident room in the community center, plastering the walls with maps spanning 30 years of regional disappearances, weather patterns, astronomical events, and land ownership records dating back to territorial days. The methodical arrangement revealed Reynolds's approach: meticulous, comprehensive, unwilling to overlook connections others might dismiss as coincidental. Red pins marked confirmed disappearances. Yellow indicated cases with similar patterns but insufficient evidence for definitive linkage. Blue represented locations where unusual symbols had been documented by hikers, forestry workers, and archaeological surveys. "I don't believe in coincidences at this scale," Reynolds told his assembled team of 6 investigators pulled from neighboring counties. Emily Townsend wasn't randomly selected, and she wasn't the first. The room fell silent as he unveiled a timeline stretching back to 1953, documenting 23 disappearances within a 70-mile radius, each occurring within 2 days of significant astronomical events. Dr. Catherine Hayes arrived from Seattle 3 days after the discovery, bringing with her archival materials from the State Historical Society and a reputation for uncovering historical truths that communities preferred to forget. Her credentials, a doctorate in anthropology with specializations in ritual practices and folklore of the Pacific Northwest, initially drew skepticism from local law enforcement accustomed to conventional investigative methods. That skepticism dissolved when she began connecting elements from the crime scene to historical patterns documented in her research. "What we're dealing with isn't random," she explained, pointing to a cluster of dates on Reynolds's timeline. "These disappearances align perfectly with equinoxes, solstices, and specific lunar phases. Someone is following an ancient calendar." Her finger traced the pattern across decades, revealing a consistency too precise to be accidental. "This is ritual behavior maintained across generations, which suggests an organized group rather than a lone perpetrator." Together, they identified 5 other missing persons cases with circumstances similar to Emily's. Solo travelers who vanished from remote areas, leaving behind vehicles and clear indications of planned short excursions. Each victim shared common characteristics. All were between 25 and 35 years of age, educated, traveling alone, and documented as having visited local historical sites or archives shortly before disappearing. Hayes brought a particular focus to the historical records of Pinecrest County, uncovering documents that had remained undisturbed in archive boxes for decades. Records from 1892 mentioned a settlement called Eventide that appeared in county documentation for only 7 years before seemingly dissolving, its residents unaccounted for in subsequent census data. Territorial maps showed its location approximately 12 miles from the cave where Emily's remains were discovered. Eventide wasn't just a settlement, Hayes explained, carefully unfolding brittle pages of a surveyor's journal dated 1894. According to this account, it was established by a group that identified themselves as preservers of ancient knowledge, who sought isolation to practice their beliefs without interference. The journal described unusual structures on the outskirts of the settlement, including stone arrangements oriented to track celestial movements and circular gatherings where ceremonies were conducted during astronomical alignments. The research led them to Harold Kavanaugh, 84 years old and the town's longest-serving former council member, who initially denied knowledge of Eventide before admitting his grandfather had spoken of mountain people who kept to the old ways and were best left undisturbed. The interview, conducted in Kavanaugh's meticulously maintained Victorian home, revealed layers of community knowledge deliberately suppressed through generations. "My grandfather warned us never to hike in the northeast valleys during certain times of year," Kavanaugh finally admitted after hours of careful questioning. "He wouldn't explain why, just said it wasn't safe." When pressed about Eventide, his demeanor shifted noticeably. "Those people didn't just disappear. Some of them integrated into Pinecrest, changed their names, became part of the community. Others remained separate, living in isolated homesteads that didn't appear on official maps." Hayes discovered Emily's name in the visitor log of the Historical Society dated 3 weeks before her disappearance, requesting access to regional maps from the 19th century with specific interest in unmarked trails and settlements. The log, maintained by the Historical Society's curator, Michael Kavanagh, Harold's son, documented 3 separate visits by Emily, each focusing on materials related to early settlements in the region. "She was asking the right questions in the wrong place," Hayes observed quietly to Reynolds as they reviewed the logs. "If the Historical Society is connected to whatever happened to her, then she might have been targeted because of her research," Reynolds completed, the implications settling heavily between them. When Reynolds obtained Emily's developed photographs from evidence storage, 37 images recovered from her apartment after her disappearance, Hayes immediately identified symbols in the background of several landscapes, subtle carvings on trees and rock faces that formed a trail marker system leading into remote areas where no official paths existed. These symbols matched fragments of those documented on the chains found with Emily's remains. "She was following breadcrumbs," Hayes concluded, arranging the photographs in sequence based on timestamps embedded in the film. "Look at the progression. Each photo leads further into the wilderness, following these markers. She thought she was documenting historical artifacts. Instead, she was being led somewhere specific." The most revealing discovery came when Reynolds cross-referenced land ownership records with family histories of Pinecrest's founding members. 6 prominent families, including the Kavanaghs, could be traced to the original Eventide settlement through property transfers, name changes, and marriage records carefully obscured through generations of paperwork. As Reynolds and Hayes compiled their evidence, a pattern emerged not just of isolated incidents, but of a deliberate structure maintained across time. A shadow community existing alongside the public face of Pinecrest, preserving practices that predated modern documentation and operating according to calendars far older than the standard January to December progression that governed ordinary lives. "We're not just looking for who killed Emily Townsend," Reynolds told Hayes as they worked late into the night, voices hushed despite being alone in the incident room. "We're looking at something that's been happening for more than a century, and a community structure designed to protect it." The wall of evidence had transformed from a collection of isolated incidents into a map of deliberate patterns, revealing not just what had happened to Emily, but why, and suggesting that unless they could identify everyone involved, the cycle would continue with the next astronomical alignment. April 24th, 1994. The forest floor, still damp from spring rain, released earthy scents into the cool morning air as Detective Reynolds and Dr. Hayes began their journey into a wilderness that had successfully concealed its secrets for generations. The weight of Emily Townsend's camera hung from Hayes's neck, the same model Emily had used 7 years earlier, loaded with copies of her final photographs. Reynolds and Hayes retraced Emily's final journey using her photographs as guides, following a nearly invisible path marked by symbols carved into trees at precise intervals, arrows, spirals, and geometric patterns weathered by decades of exposure. Each symbol, photographed by Emily in the weeks before her disappearance, formed waypoints on a trail invisible to casual hikers, but unmistakable once identified. "These markings aren't random vandalism," Hayes explained, gently tracing the outline of a spiral carved into ancient bark. "They're part of a navigational system using symbology documented in European esoteric traditions dating back to the 16th century. She gestured to the surrounding forest, untouched by development and rarely visited by recreational hikers. Perfect isolation, a landscape that preserves secrets through its very inaccessibility. The two investigators followed Emily's documented route, pausing at each location she had photographed. The progression revealed Emily's methodical nature. Each image captured not just the symbols, but their surrounding context, creating a documentary record of her discovery. She thought she was documenting historical artifacts, Hayes observed, as they passed a boulder etched with what appeared to be astronomical alignments. But she was actually following breadcrumbs designed to lead certain people to the sacred site. After hiking approximately 5 miles, the trail became steeper, leading toward a ridgeline marked on no official maps. Forest Service records indicated this area had been surveyed only twice in the past 50 years. Once in 1965, and again in 1982, with both reports noting terrain unsuitable for recreational development and recommending the area remain undesignated wilderness. The path terminated at what appeared to be a solid rock face until Hayes identified barely perceptible handholds forming a climbing route to a narrow ledge 20 feet above. Evidence technicians had already secured the area with climbing ropes and safety equipment, allowing the investigators to ascend to the concealed entrance. Behind a growth of dense vegetation, they discovered the cave entrance, deliberately obscured and accessible only to those who knew exactly where to look. "This isn't a naturally occurring formation," Reynolds noted, examining the entrance with his flashlight. "These edges have been worked with tools, widened just enough for human passage while remaining invisible from below." The technical skill required for such modifications suggested resources and knowledge beyond what most individuals could access independently. While the field investigation continued, a parallel financial investigation uncovered disturbing patterns. Reynolds obtained warrants for financial records of prominent community members flagged during their investigation, revealing a pattern of anonymous donations to a shell organization called Heritage Preservation Fund that corresponded with dates of astronomical significance. The fund, established in 1956, had no clear charitable purpose, but maintained substantial assets managed through a complex network of trusts and holding companies. The timing of these donations aligns perfectly with our disappearance timeline, noted financial crimes specialist Agent Sarah Morales, who joined the investigation on loan from the FBI. Large transfers occurring within 48 hours of the spring and autumn equinoxes, winter and summer solstices, and specific lunar phases mentioned in the historical documents you recovered. Back at the cave site, forensic analysis yielded evidence connecting the location to historical practices predating modern record-keeping. Soil samples from around the altar contained compounds found in specific ceremonial incense documented in European witch trials from the 1600s, suggesting rituals preserved and passed down through generations. Carbon dating of organic material recovered from crevices in the altar stone indicated ceremonial usage spanning at least 200 years. The most significant discovery came 3 days into the evidence processing. Technicians identified a hidden compartment within the base of the stone altar, concealed by a precisely fitted stone panel that matched the surrounding material so perfectly it had initially escaped detection. Inside, they found a waterproof metal container holding a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Emily. Emily's journal, recovered from the waterproof container hidden within the altar itself, documented her growing realization that she had stumbled onto something dangerous. The entries began with academic curiosity, notes about local historical anomalies, sketches of symbols she encountered, and coordinates of locations she planned to visit. By the 3rd week, her tone shifted noticeably. April 12th, found another marker today, deeper into restricted wilderness than any hiker would normally venture. These symbols create a pattern that doesn't align with any documented Native American or settler traditions. Their precision and preservation suggest continuous maintenance. Her final entry, dated September 14th, 1987, the day before her disappearance, conveyed growing alarm. I'm being watched when I visit the Historical Society. Someone follows me back to my motel. Tomorrow, I'll hike out to the coordinates I found, and then leave town immediately. Whatever this is, it's still active, still protected. The connection between the Kavanaugh family and these symbols is too consistent to be coincidental. DNA analysis from the chains match 3 unsolved disappearances, including a case from 1979 that had been attributed to a serial killer operating across state lines. The genetic profiles, partial but distinctive, connected victims spanning decades. Evidence that the altar had served its purpose repeatedly, with Emily representing only the most recent in a lineage of carefully selected individuals. The breakthrough came when Hayes connected the distinctive metallurgical composition of the chains to a foundry operated by the Kavanaugh family from 1870 through 1926, the same family whose elder member had deflected their questions about eventide. The foundry's records, preserved in county business archives, documented specialized metalwork commissioned by unnamed clients and described only as ceremonial implements in the company ledgers. The Kavanaughs aren't just witnesses, Reynolds concluded during the evening briefing, voice steady despite the implications of what they'd discovered. They're custodians of whatever this is, facilitators who've maintained these practices across generations while presenting a respectable public face to the community. As the investigators assembled their evidence, the pieces formed a mosaic more disturbing than any conventional crime. Emily Townsend hadn't simply stumbled into danger. She had been methodically tracked, assessed, and ultimately selected by individuals operating within a framework of beliefs and practices maintained in secret for centuries. The forest had protected these secrets through isolation, the community through silence, and the participants through careful separation between their public and private lives. But Emily's meticulous documentation, preserved despite everything that followed, had finally illuminated the concealed path that led not just to her fate, but to a system of ritualized selection that had claimed victims long before her and, if not stopped, would continue long after. December 18th, 1994. The mountains surrounding Pinecrest stood silent under early winter snow, the pristine landscape concealing decades of carefully orchestrated disappearances. Inside a temporary command center established in the county sheriff's annex building, Detective Marcus Reynolds studied surveillance photographs spread across a conference table, each image revealing fragments of a truth the community had refused to acknowledge for generations. As the winter solstice approached, Reynolds coordinated with federal authorities to place surveillance on 7 individuals identified through financial records, historical connections, and DNA evidence linked to the ceremonial site. The operation, codenamed Eventide, involved 23 federal agents, specialized forensic teams, and tactical units positioned throughout the region. Weather forecasts predicted heavy snowfall for the solstice, December 21st, creating additional challenges for the planned intervention. "This isn't about Emily anymore," Reynolds told his task force during the final briefing, his voice steady despite the weight of what they'd uncovered. "This is about ending something that's been happening for generations, while an entire community looked the other way." The room fell silent as he displayed a timeline of disappearances dating back to 1894, each victim representing a life interrupted by practices preserved in shadow. Surveillance teams documented unusual activity beginning 3 days before the solstice. Vehicles traveling to remote locations, supplies being transported to properties with no official residences, and communications patterns suggesting coordinated preparation for a significant event. Thermal imaging captured from aircraft revealed heat signatures at an apparently abandoned hunting lodge 20 miles from the cave system where Emily had been found. The raid, executed with precision at 4:17 a.m. on December 21st, encountered minimal resistance. The hunting lodge, a substantial structure absent from county property records despite its size and elaborate construction, yielded evidence beyond what investigators had anticipated. Ceremonial robes hand-embroidered with symbols matching those from the cave site. Astronomical calculation tools of remarkable precision, and a hidden library containing documentation of offerings dating back to 1894. 100 years of meticulous record-keeping by what called itself the Eventide Fellowship. They documented everything, Dr. Hayes noted as she examined ledgers preserved in climate-controlled containers. Names, dates, selection criteria, the astronomical conditions required for each ritual. This wasn't improvised. This was a methodology refined across generations. The records revealed a belief system combining elements of European esotericism, astronomical worship, and a conviction that certain individuals could serve as conduits between physical and spiritual dimensions when prepared through specific rituals. 11 arrests included prominent community figures, the high school principal, 2 county employees, and Harold Kavanaugh's son Michael, whose basement contained historical artifacts connected to the original Eventide settlement. These weren't isolated individuals, but representatives of a parallel community structure that had operated alongside public institutions while maintaining practices hidden from outside scrutiny. The evidence recovery process continued for 17 days, yielding over 900 artifacts, documents, and ceremonial implements. Most disturbing was a calendar projecting ritual dates through 2025, with notations identifying potential vessels currently living in communities across 3 states. This discovery accelerated coordination with law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest, establishing protective measures for individuals who might have been targeted in future rituals. During his interrogation, Michael Kavanaugh revealed that Emily had been targeted after photographing key ritual sites, but insisted she had been chosen as worthy rather than murdered, explaining in chilling detail how the preservation process was meant to honor those who would serve as vessels between worlds. His demeanor, clinical, unapologetic, convinced of the righteousness of actions that had ended multiple lives, provided investigators with insight into the psychological framework that had sustained these practices across generations. "We preserved what others would have destroyed," Kavanaugh stated during his 6th hour of questioning. The modern world has forgotten that certain boundaries require guardians, certain doorways need sentinels. Emily understood this. Her research led her to us because she was meant to serve. When confronted with evidence of suffering, with the terror Emily must have experienced, Kavanaugh responded with genuine confusion. Fear is momentary. Transcendence is eternal. The case against the Eventide Fellowship members proceeded through federal courts, resulting in multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. 3 additional arrests followed as the investigation expanded, including a county records clerk who had systematically altered documentation to conceal property ownership, and a Forest Service employee who had redirected patrols away from ritual sites during critical dates. At Emily Townsend's proper funeral, held on April 15, 1995, exactly 8 years after her disappearance, the Pinecrest Community Church overflowed with attendees. Investigators who had searched for answers for 7 years, family members who had never abandoned hope, and community members confronting their collective failure to recognize what had existed in their midst. Detective Reynolds placed her recovered journal beside her urn, fulfilling a promise made to Diane Townsend that her sister's own words would accompany her final rest. Dr. Hayes established a research foundation dedicated to identifying and properly memorializing other victims of the Eventide Fellowship across generations, ensuring that those who disappeared would finally have their stories told. The Foundation's work expanded beyond documentation to include critical examination of how communities can become complicit in concealing abuses through silence, denial, and misplaced loyalty to established institutions. What happened in Pinecrest isn't unique, Hayes explained during a conference on ritual violence held 18 months after the arrests. Similar patterns exist wherever isolation combines with unquestioned authority and belief systems that dehumanize selected individuals. The specific practices may differ, but the underlying mechanisms remain consistent and detectable if we're willing to recognize the warning signs. The mountains keep their secrets behind walls of stone and time, but sometimes justice finds its way through even the narrowest passages. Emily Townsend disappeared into legend but emerged as truth, her final journey revealing not just her own fate, but the dark current running beneath decades of silence. Her meticulous documentation, preserved against all odds, became the foundation for understanding and dismantling practices that had claimed lives across generations. In the years following the Eventide Fellowship prosecution, Pinecrest underwent a painful but necessary reckoning with its past. Memorial markers were placed for each identified victim, acknowledging both their lives and the collective failure that had allowed their deaths to remain unexplained for so long. The cave system was permanently sealed following complete documentation, preventing it from becoming a macabre attraction, while preserving evidence for ongoing research into ritual practices that might exist elsewhere. Emily's journal, published with her sister's permission but with certain details redacted to prevent replication of ritual elements, became a foundational text for investigators specializing in isolated community dynamics and ritual violence. Her final entries reveal not just fear, but determination, a commitment to understanding what she had discovered, even as she recognized the danger it presented. In this way, she achieved a form of justice that transcended her own case, creating ripples that would protect others from similar fates for generations to come.